Hi. When I was a kid, I knew about the organs of the body, but I couldn't work out how they all fit in. I think I assumed they must be neatly organised with a bit of space in between them. Probably the illustrations of the time for children showed that sort of thing. I couldn't really work it out. It wasn't, even through all my school years, it wasn't until I got to university and I started taking bodies apart that I realised, wow, this stuff is really packed in here. We had a comment, was it last week? Somebody asked, could I go through all the abdominal viscera? And I thought, oh. And then I was teaching last week, chatting to a student, she wasn't entirely sure where the stomach was. So I thought, that's a good idea that. We should go through all of the abdominal viscera. So yeah, I've had an interest in anatomy for a very long time, and it hasn't really disappeared. I think the stage I'm at now is the more I know, the more I realise I don't know, and the more I try to hold in my head, the harder it is for me to hold everything in my head. If that makes any sense at all. I think it's the same as anything. As you become an expert, you realise you don't know that very much at all. Anyway, right. So what is the abdomen? And then what we'll do is we're going to take all these parts away from the model. So as we go, we'll point things out. As we remove things, we'll try to see and pay attention to what lies posterior to that organ or nearby, so we've got an idea of where things are relative to one another. Also, remember that whenever we're talking about the body, whenever we use left or right, we're talking about the body's left and the body's right. Okay, not our view, but the body's left, the body's right. And we'll work our way back to the posterior abdominal wall and see what we see. So then the abdomen is the region of the trunk between the thorax and the pelvis, is your typical textbook description, which sounds nice and tidy. Now at the superior end it is nice and tidy. What we're seeing here is the diaphragm. So the diaphragm does cleanly separate the abdomen from the thorax. So the diaphragm's got kind of this curvy shape to it. So it's a three-dimensional thing here. It's curving over the liver here. But the diaphragm is a muscular sheet that separates the thorax from the abdomen. Now, inferiorly, it's a little bit harder because the pelvis, well, here's the pelvis, and the pelvis has these bony parts. So much of the pelvic viscera is down here. This is pelvis, but the abdomen also extends all the way down here. So really, what's happening is that the contents of the abdomen are covered in a layer of peritoneum, like a thin sheet. So it's almost like all of these contents here, like it's all in a bag. And where that bag sinks down into the pelvis, the abdominal contents are sat on top of the pelvic contents, the pelvic viscera, and it's the peritoneum then that's really separating the pelvis, the pelvic viscera from the abdominal viscera. So then that distinction between abdomen and pelvis is a little bit softer down here. And of course, when women get pregnant and the uterus becomes enlarged, or even when your bladder fills with urine and that becomes enlarged, those push from the pelvis up into the abdomen. So there's a bit of interplay between the abdomen and the pelvis. Okay, what can we see? So we see some organs up here. The biggest organ is the liver. It is a very big organ. It's on the right side of the abdomen, but it's extending across the midline to the left side. So it's a very large organ, and it's just underneath the diaphragm. So as the diaphragm moves up and down as well, the liver will move up and down with it. So there's an interplay between the thorax and the abdomen there. So there's the liver, and then nestling into the liver on the left side, this is the stomach. So the stomach, as you can see, is pushed up into the liver. You know, if I take that out of the way, so I don't knock it off. If we lift the liver up, that's how we'd see the stomach nestling into the liver there. Do you see? So they're very tightly stuck together. Diaphragm, diaphragm. And of course, the esophagus passes down through the diaphragm, and if I pop this out, there's the esophagus there, so it dives through the diaphragm, there's a hole in the diaphragm. Now if I put the liver back, this here, so if we if we take away the skin, we take away the muscles of the anterior abdominal wall, and we take away the peritoneum lining, the parietal peritoneum lining the abdominal cavity, we see this here, and this is the greater omentum. This gets called the policeman of the gut. And what it does is it's a connective tissue sheet that's hanging down from the greater curvature of the stomach, and it's covering all of these organs down here. And it's layers of peritoneum, it's got fat in it, it's got blood vessels. Its job seems to be is that if there is some inflammation in the bowel down here, it will adhere to that inflammation and help prevent it spreading too far. Now, if we take the greater omentum off, now we can see the GI tract. The GI tract, or the gastrointestinal tract, is the bulk of the viscera that we find within the abdominal cavity. It's a long continuous tube from the esophagus and stomach through the small intestine and the large intestine all the way through to the rectum and the anal canal. The rectum is in the pelvis and the anal canal is in the perineum. Now what we see is we can see a little bit of large bowel here. This is the ascending colon. And we see a little bit of large bowel here. This is the transverse colon, and then we see a little bit of large bowel around there, the descending colon. So this is large colon or large bowel. This then is the small intestine or the small bowel. If we remove, you can see how the liver and the stomach are all superior, and this stuff is squashed up against it. If I remove the liver, here's the stomach. Now the stomach is continuous with all of this. We often see in models and textbooks that the transverse colon runs across here, and it looks like a picture frame around the small bowel. In you, if you're sat up, your transverse colon is probably drooping down a little bit like that. So if you're looking at abdominal x-rays, the transverse colon probably isn't going to do this. It's probably going to be looping it down here because it's actually got a mesentery. So the mesentery is a double fold of peritoneum so that's how the blood vessels and nerves and lymphatics get to and from the bowel. And because the transverse colon's got a mesentery, it means it can move around. The ascending colon and the descending colon are fixed in place to the posterior abdominal wall, so they don't move around. The small bowel also has a mesentery, so it is fairly mobile. And of course what's happening is the food is being passed into the stomach, and then it gets pushed into the small bowel, and peristalsis and the shortening and lengthening of the small bowel pushes the food along the small intestine, and the nutrients get absorbed from it, and then it gets pushed into the large bowel, which largely reabsorbs water and that sort of thing. So it's helpful if it moves around. Right, okay, so stomach. Now, if we take away the stomach, we can see some other viscera deep to that. So this here, this is the pancreas. So the pancreas is doing two things. It's making hormones that it secretes into the blood to steady blood glucose levels, and it's making an exocrine secretion, a pancreatic juice that it's going to secrete into, if I take away the transverse colon, the duodenum here. So the duodenum is the first part of the small intestine, and it's forming a C shape. It's curling around the pancreas here. So the pancreas has got this duct, and it's going to secrete into the duodenum to help with digestion of the contents that you've just eaten that the stomach is pushing into the duodenum. Right? Pancreas, duodenum. So out here, laterally, that's the spleen. The spleen is at the tail of the pancreas, so it's on the lateral left side of the body. You've got one pancreas, you've got one spleen. So the spleen is a component of the immune system. It's a store of red blood cells, it's a store of platelets, so it can help with clotting and help with replacing red blood cells if you lose them, if you have an injury and you lose some blood and that sort of thing. But it's also a site where you find lots of lymphocytes and macrophages, and it's a site where parts of the immune system are stored and where parts of the immune system can be activated and things like that. So it's got a couple of big roles, not least immunological. In fact, it sends red blood cells, once it's broken them down, to the liver, which is nearby. It's got a blood vessel and it sends it across the liver. Now the liver has got 500 odd different functions. It's got a huge number of jobs. It has a huge amount of blood passing through it. All the blood from the GI tract passes through the liver, and the liver is wrapped around the inferior vena cava, which we'll see more of as we get deeper. So blood from the gut and the spleen passes through the liver to the inferior vena cava, back to the rest of the circulation. Okay, so small bowel. Now, the duodenum is the first part of the small intestine. It passes food into the jejunum, and the jejunum becomes the ileum. So the small intestine isn't the same along its entire length. Food passes, so the jejunum is out on this side, and the ileum is over on this side. And food passes along the length from the duodenum to the jejunum to the ileum. And if you look at the histology and the structure of the small intestine as we go along its length, it changes slightly and it does slightly different roles. So if we take the small intestine out, we can see that the small intestine is, as I said, kind of suspended, strung from the posterior abdominal wall by mesentery, so this can all move around. So now we've taken off the small intestine, we can see that duodenum. This is the curve I was talking about here. First part, second part, third part, then it goes up again, fourth part. And you can see here, this is where the pancreas secretes into the duodenum. In fact, the other thing we've got here is, you might have spotted it, it's the green bit there. That there is the gallbladder. So the gallbladder is storing bile, and it's going to pass that bile through some ducts eventually down into this point here. So the common bile duct is going to pass bile into the duodenum here at the same point that the pancreas passes into the duodenum. And the bile is also going to help with digestion. It's going to help emulsify fats and that sort of thing. And remember those 500 different jobs that the liver does? Well, some of the waste it produces is going to get passed into the small bowel to be removed from the body through the common bile duct, through the same route. That's why bile is green, and that's what makes feces brown. In fact, it's recycled red blood cells. Anyway, so duodenum here. Now what else can we see? So we can see the ascending colon and the descending colon a little bit better. We can see the posterior abdominal wall, and we can see some of the blood vessels supplying blood to the large bowel here. Now, on the superior edge of the pancreas, so if I take this off, we just jump ahead, we can see the major blood vessels. This is the aorta, the abdominal aorta. So the aorta is supplying blood to the thorax, to the abdomen, and eventually it's going to send off branches to the pelvis and the lower limbs and what have you. That's the aorta. Now the aorta has got 3 anterior branches, and those anterior branches are going to supply blood to most of the things in the abdomen. So just superior to the pancreas we have the celiac trunk, and you can see it sending off branches to the pancreas, to the spleen, to the duodenum, and off to the liver and that sort of thing. Now on the inferior side of the pancreas we can see the superior mesenteric artery and the superior mesenteric vein. So the superior mesenteric artery is a branch of the aorta. The superior mesenteric vein is going to be sending blood back to the portal vein and the liver. Down here we can see the bladder. So the bladder is in the pelvis, and normally then if we had peritoneum here, the bladder would be covered over by peritoneum, and that would mark the inferior end of the abdominal cavity. That's where the abdomen would end. The descending colon then becomes the sigmoid colon here, as it makes a bit of an S shape and wiggles around, and when it goes back there and straightens out it becomes the rectum. That's what the rectum means. Rectus means straight, so the rectum is the straight part of the large bowel and the last part before the anal canal. Alright, if we take that off then we can see the aorta, and next to it is the inferior vena cava. So this is going to carry blood back from the abdomen. The liver is going to send blood into the inferior vena cava, and then that's going to go through the diaphragm and straight back into the heart, into the right side of the heart, so into the right atrium, and then off around the body. There's the superior vena cava up there. So inferior vena cava, aorta. We can see a whole bunch of blood vessels branching from it. The really important ones are on here, and of course we can see these two. These are the kidneys. So the kidneys are posterior in the abdomen. They're in the posterior abdominal wall. They are posterior to the peritoneum, that connective tissue layer. So they get called retroperitoneal. So the kidneys are receiving a huge amount of blood. So they've got some big blood vessels. You can see the veins here because the renal veins are anterior. So the left renal vein has to run quite a long way, and it's running anterior to the aorta, but the renal arteries are posterior to those, and they're going to be large as well. So large blood vessels supplying small organs mean that these organs are doing something with the blood, and they're processing the blood. Of course, what they're doing is largely managing the amount of fluid inside the body. You are a bag of salty water. That's what your cells evolved from, and now you have a bag that you carry that salty water around in, and you have to maintain the right amount of salty water and the right amount of salt in it for your cells to be happy and to function normally. So that's largely what the kidneys are doing. They're managing all of that. So then from each kidney we can see these. So these are the ureters, and the ureters then are going to pass urine from the kidney down to the bladder, and then on the posterior abdominal wall overlying these muscles here. So you see a number of muscles making up the posterior abdominal wall. Now on the superior pole of each kidney we have a suprarenal gland or an adrenal gland. Now the adrenal glands make adrenaline, adrenaline and noradrenaline. Obviously that's involved in the fight or flight response, in the adrenaline rush, in the activation of the sympathetic nervous system so you can fight or fly away, run away. And they also make a whole bunch of steroid hormones, glucocorticoids, mineralocorticoids, that sort of thing, which manage manage homeostasis, manage metabolism and that sort of thing. So again, related to the gut and energy and food and that sort of thing. So suprarenal glands. We've still got the spleen out here. So can you see how the spleen is typically, it's a little bit posterior, but it's lateral. And can you see how it's nestling up into the diaphragm? Whereas the kidneys are a little bit more inferior. And the left kidney, do you see it's a little bit higher than the right kidney? And that's because of the liver. So the liver is so big, it's actually pushing the right kidney, so it's a little bit lower in the abdomen. So if you were to look at a transverse section across here, you might see just one kidney on one side, and the spleen, and all these other bits, but you might miss the other kidney. You go a bit lower, you'll get a section through both kidneys. You'll see them both on CT or MR. You can see the diaphragm then arching back there. These thick muscles here, these are the psoas muscles, the psoas major, and it's got a little psoas minor lying on the top of it. This is iliacus, and these two muscles will join, insert into the femur and give hip flexion, so they'll lift your knee towards your chest. These muscles here, these are quadratus lumborum, and they're running kind of in that direction from the vertebral column to the pelvis, which will give you a little bit of lateral flexion of your trunk, right? These arteries here, these we were talking about last week, these are the testicular arteries running from the aorta in the abdomen all the way down to the scrotum, because the testes started to form up here and then they descended in the embryo and the fetus, and they trailed their blood vessels behind, and you can see the testicular veins draining back. The left one goes to the left renal vein and the right one goes directly into the inferior vena cava. So the aorta ends when it divides into left and right common iliac arteries. That's what we're seeing here. The left and right common iliac arteries then divide again into an external iliac artery, which is going to run down to the lower limb, run down to the thigh and the leg, and then an internal iliac artery, which is going to go down into the pelvis and supply blood to the viscera of the pelvis, and also to the external genitalia and that sort of thing. So if I take the stomach off, there's the pancreas, and if I take the pancreas off, there's the kidney. So that's the sort of layering that we're dealing with. Can you see the adrenal glands there? Just popping up. Now the aorta You can't see it because it's just running through a gap in the diaphragm there, but the inferior vena cava has just been cut because we've removed the liver. And that's it. I can't take anything else off. If I was to take more off, we'd be at the muscles, and I'd take the muscles off and we'd be out the other side. That's what you find inside the abdominal cavity if you take things out bit by bit. Well, I enjoyed that, so thank you for that suggestion. It did remind me of what it was like when I was a kid, trying to work out how all this stuff was packed in and where it all was exactly. Now I do kind of take it for granted. But there you go. Okay, see you guys next week.